this presentation is one I did for Dr. David Anderson's anthropology class in 2020. And so it is, it kind of pushed me into putting our flood recovery efforts back in 2015 into a more densely elaborated presentation mode. And so I'm just going to share that same presentation with you all today. It's going to be in a Society for Historical Archaeology journal article coming out later this year with a lot of other NAHAR folks and Heritage at Risk committee folks. And so I've kind of renamed the presentation, While I Breathe, I Hope, which is one of the two state mottos of the state of South Carolina. Our other state motto is Prepared in Mind and Resources, which when I think about it together, I was looking at other state mottos across the US, and South Carolina has a very uniquely situated dual state motto situation that basically speak to preparing and recovering from disaster, which I thought was quite interesting. So I'm using it as part of my paper and my talk. So While I Breathe, I Hope kind of speaks to that recovery effort. But let's get started, because this is a long presentation. David can attest to that, but it is densely packed with information I hope you'll never have to use. And if you do need this presentation, I'll be happy to share it with you and all my notes, because it's going to have a lot of information that you can reference. So let's get started. So this presentation contains recommendations and advice that I hope you'll never have to use in the future. And so I host disaster recovery workshops and preparedness workshops. So at the end, I'd like to take kind of a poll and see what you all would be interested in learning more about, whether it's textiles, bone, artifacts, documents, whatever you are most interested in learning how to secure and recover in the face of a disaster. So to lay the kind of groundwork for my program, which MJ mentioned, the Heritage Trust Program at the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, and where we were during the flood of 2015, these first few slides are going to go through that. So the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, or SCDNR, manages over 1.1 million acres of land across the state. 75 of those are heritage preserves, covering a total of almost 100,000 acres throughout the state. And the heritage preserves range from 1 acre to over 24,000 acres each. 58 of these heritage preserves are natural area preserves, and 17 are cultural area preserves. The cultural heritage preserves, a total of almost 4,000 acres, are only managed by the SCDNR Archaeology team. Wildlife Management Area Lands, or WMAs, also called heritage preserves or WMA lands, like Botany Bay Plantation Heritage Preserve, which most of y'all are familiar with because of the Pocky Island Shell Ring Complex, is located on a wildlife management area and freshwater fisheries division area of land. And once a property has been dedicated as a heritage preserve like these properties, it is permanently protected from development. The Heritage Trust Act, which established the Heritage Trust Program in 1974, states in part that portions of the state's rich natural and cultural diversity be set aside as heritage preserves and sites and protected for the benefit of present and future generations. For once disturbed, they cannot be wholly restored. Such areas and features are irreplaceable as laboratories for scientific research for present and future generations, and the benefit of an enduring resource of natural and cultural areas was why we established this system of heritage preserves and sites. We protect the system, we gather and disseminate information regarding it, and we continue our archaeological and scientific research on these properties. And we otherwise encourage the assisting and preservation of natural and cultural areas and features of the state through this law. Funding, which is a large question we get not only from the public, but from people within the DNR, is how are we funded? Our team is funded not from hunting and fishing licenses or boating licenses like a lot of other colleagues we have at the DNR, but the Heritage Trust Program funding comes from the South Carolina State Deed Stamp Tax, or the recording fee. We get 10 cents on every $1.30, and this fee is deposited into our bank account and reinvested. So when people buy and sell homes or land, the tax they pay on that feeds into our budget. The Cultural Heritage Trust team, or the archaeology team, of which I'm a part, numbered only 3 in 2015 when we had the flood. We now have over 20 people on our team, and that number increases to about 30 sometimes when we have interns. And so this is me in my hot pink jacket with Sean Taylor, our senior archaeologist, kneeling down, and our senior property manager, Brian Long, standing up. And we're standing at Fort Frederick Heritage Preserve, which I talked about at the SHA conference just a little while ago. It's the oldest British colonial fort that's falling into the Beaufort River. At the time of the 2015 flood, our staff that numbered 3, our offices were at the DNR headquarters on the State House grounds in Columbia, South Carolina. All of our archives were stored in off-site facilities at various locations around the state, including the home office of a colleague and contractor. And I'm just going to pop this map up because it kind of divides our state into more geographical regions that our law enforcement officers respond to. Our home office, or the home office where these archives were stored, as well as our offices on the State House grounds, were in Region 3B, which is Richland County, and that is the state capital of South Carolina. So I'm going to set the scene of the storm. South Carolina is the pie shape in the dead center of the map. And as I talk about these tropical features that you see, you'll get to a better understanding of how much rain we got. As September 2015 drew to a close, a stationary frontal boundary set up camp over coastal South Carolina, drenching the state for days on end. By October the 1st, the National Weather Service began issuing warnings that a historic and potentially life-threatening rainfall event was expected during the weekend. Low pressure formed on a stationary front, hugging the coast, while strong high pressure built to the north, according to our state climatologist, Dr. Hope Mizell, and she used to work across the hall from me at DNR. This pattern resulted in a strong flow of tropical moisture off the warm Atlantic waters, increasing rainfall intensity over the already saturated state. And to complicate the forecast, Hurricane Joaquin, that you see kind of circulating right here, had re-intensified to a Category 4 storm over the Bahamas. The arrangement of atmospheric features, which included an upper level area of low pressure near the Alabama-Georgia border, high pressure to the north, and a distant Hurricane Joaquin, created a river of air that was condensed into historic rains. Across the state, the rainfall totals ranged from 10 inches to 26 inches. So during the 2015 flood event, 158 SCDNR law enforcement officers were deployed across 11 South Carolina counties. They conducted 930 rescues and assists, putting in 12,000 man-hours. There were more than 1,500 total water rescues and assists during the flood. 50 dams were breached or completely failed in the state. 540 roads and bridges were closed. Over 20,000 people were displaced. 36 of the 46 South Carolina counties were declared disaster areas. 19 people lost their lives, and there was a total in $2.2 billion in damages. And I just checked those figures with our state climatologist. She literally got back to me 5 minutes before this presentation started, because some of these numbers, especially the total damages, change after disasters. But she said that those were pretty spot on. So the DNR Land, Water, and Conservation Division, of which our team, the archaeology team, is a part, is also home to the State Climate Office and the Flood Mitigation Program. So our team is in a unique situation to work with people at the forefront of disaster and recovery within the state. And as you'll see in a few minutes, we are very lucky to have the resources we did for this recovery effort. And I want to state here at the start, and I state this for students frequently, in the rush of all the chaos of a disaster like that, the one thing to constantly remind ourselves of, even during a pandemic, is that the protection and preservation of human life is the most important thing during a disaster. You should never risk your life or the life of others to rescue cultural resources, and make sure you always have time to evacuate in a situation like this. So this is what I saw on my living room television, just over there, on Monday, October the 5th, 2015, before we could reach the archives that were underwater. I started preparing a specific recovery plan at home, right here in my living room, based off of information I had received in a one-day disaster preparedness and recovery workshop 5 years prior to this event. So on Wednesday, October the 7th, 2015, the home office of which these archives were stored, we were able to reach. That home office was farther down this hill from this image at a lower elevation, so it was more underwater than this home and this trailer that you can see here. We had to enter the property from the road above Timberlane Drive, which is this road that you can't even see because it's underwater. It was at a higher elevation to the west, and we had to climb a fence to get onto the property. So what are the things that you need to have in place prior to a disaster? I'm going to walk you through some recommendations based off of our experience during the 2015 flood and from various workshops and trainings I have attended before and since. So let's start with the pre-disaster preparations. These are quick reference guides that you can purchase. The Field Guide to Emergency Response can be purchased at the link here. And if you want all these links, I'm happy to provide them later on. And then the emergency salvage wheel, it's double-sided, magnetic. I have one on my fridge. I have one on the table right here as I write this journal article. And all these documents are in the emergency response field guide that show a list of emergency supplies and field guide assessments and so forth. So I would highly recommend purchasing these and having them on hand. The incident command system, for those of y'all who haven't heard about the incident command system, this was something that we had not gone through prior to the flood of 2015, but we certainly went through after. So the incident command system, or ICS, is more common in the emergency field of like fire and EMS. Cultural resource managers typically aren't familiar with this, but you can take these free courses online for FEMA training in the ICS. And I highly recommend that. Course 100 is free, and they go all the way up, I think, to 800. This is how the ICS is set up with an incident commander all the way down to individual people going out and running to get things. For an archaeologist, for a cultural resource manager managing maybe a curation facility, you don't necessarily need a strike team, but this is probably more of what you need. So this is the adaptation of the ICS system for a cultural institution. This is what we use at Parker Annex. The ICS may have to be adapted for your cultural institution and staff based off of your size needs. I would recommend establishing an ICS system prior to a disaster and running through a mock scenario. And May Day is the best day to do this. The 1st of May every year is a day when you can kind of get your team together and run through mock scenarios and really talk about the what ifs for your facility and your team. Emergency go bags or go kits, depends on how you want to talk about it. This is mine. This is my go kit that's in my back room. And this is for initial assessment only, not long-term recovery efforts that will require more supplies. And you'll need reference documents in this kit. You can see my purple binder here. And this is for the assessment and recovery of your facility. If you have like a curatorial facility, an archaeology facility, I have documents that I can share with you. And this is, again, just for initial recovery when you're going into that facility after an impact. So you have muck boots and safety vests and water and hard hats with headlamps and PPE, which we're all very familiar with now. All those kinds of things need to go into that go bag or initial kit. Go bags are also for impacts for families. Typically in a personal go bag, you want to have 3 days of supplies in a personal go bag. This is a go bag for cultural resource recovery. So disaster recovery kits. These are some examples of some that I've seen from Smithsonian, the images here. So disaster recovery kits are salvage and emergency kits. Make the kits fit your organization and facility needs. Kits should be inventoried regularly at a minimum of once a year, and make the kits mobile if possible. You'll see some of these are mobile and some are not. Keep the kits on the 2nd floor in multiple locations or elevated to avoid water damage. Know where your AC units are located and avoid placing kits in areas below AC units to avoid overflow AC units damaging the kits. Pre-made kits are an option. There's the shield kit here at the lower right, but they are not recommended. I feel the same way about pre-made medical kits that I do about pre-made disaster recovery kits. You use about a fourth of the things in there. You really need to make them fit your institution. One of the other recommendations I've received from somebody who's a fireman who also does cultural rescue work, he recommends keeping a kit on your first and second floor because if you end up having a fire situation, the one on your second floor is probably going to be the one that gets destroyed because of fire rushing to the top. So, but in a flood situation, you want one on your top floor. So this is a disaster recovery kit at the Dumbarton House in Washington, D.C. when I did Heritage Emergency and Response Training, or HART. And they keep theirs in their garage. They don't even keep it in the historic building. So that's another option for you. These are also disaster recovery supplies. When I was doing the HART training, we got behind the scenes tours of the Library of Congress. They have entire rooms devoted to disaster prep and recovery and individual boxes for each of their supplies. It was a gorgeous assortment of things that I wish I had space to keep. So this was a prime example of, if you have the space, please do this. Otherwise, you can keep an old bin in your garage. You know, you do what you can. Medical and safety. So designate a safety officer for future recovery efforts now. I recommend medical training from Knowles Wilderness Medical Institution. They have wilderness first aid, wilderness first responder, wilderness EMT courses. I'm a certified wilderness first responder with CPR training, and our entire staff are wilderness first aid trained. And that may seem excessive in this situation, but consider that your local hospitals are not going to be easily accessible in a disaster scenario. So in the city of Columbia, where we are here, we have a handful of hospitals, large hospitals. But during 2015, what would take me 5 or 10 minutes to reach one of those hospitals ended up taking 2 hours. And when you reach that 2-hour threshold, you are technically in a wilderness environment. So having a level of medical training to this extent, if you find yourself in a disaster scenario, it could be incredibly helpful, if not life-saving. And this is an example of one of my med kits. This is one of my older med kits. We have multiple med kits that we keep with us in the field. But I had one of these in my truck when we went to recover things from the flood of 2015. So I recommend putting one of these together. I also recommend never forgetting to eat, drink plenty of water in disaster situations, and take care of and document injuries as they occur. You always want to take care of your family, your friends, your pets, your neighbors first before going to recover your facility. Dress appropriately for disaster recovery and take extra clothing with you, such as long sleeves, long trousers, boots, mask, gloves, hard hats, and headlamps on your hard hat, not a flashlight in your hand, because you're going to need your hands to stabilize yourself. Remember that electricity, water, heat, AC may be out, or more dangerously, what we found in the flood of 2015, that electricity may still be on in a flooded environment. Anything can be in that flood water, such as fuel, sewage, dead animals or live animals, sharp objects, unstable ground, or no ground at all. So some of the scenarios were somebody had a mailbox out next to the road, they could stand on their front porch, but what they couldn't see under that flooded water was that there was no ground in between their home and the road. More inclement weather could be on its way, so you need to always keep tabs on if you are constantly in a safe and secure and stable environment, or if that environment is going to change. And if you need to secure the facility and evacuate, do that as soon as possible. So we're going to talk just a few seconds about the psychological impacts of disaster, because like y'all, I'm an archaeologist, I'm a cultural resource manager, I'm not a psychologist. But this is a chart that was shown during my HART training in Washington, D.C., and it rings true. You know, we have these pre-disaster, we're getting ready, we're kind of heightened on the adrenaline, we're getting things set, And then you have this heroic period where you're going through and you're recovering things. You hit the honeymoon period, and then it's just a disillusionment of how long it's really going to take to get all this taken care of. The honeymoon period peak is also where you start to see a trickle off of your volunteers because they feel like they've done their 1 or 2 weeks of help and they're ready to get on with their regular lives. So these are things to kind of keep in mind. And you can see the website here to kind of look at more psychological impacts of disaster if you want to, but it is something to keep in mind as a cultural resource manager. It is going to impact your recovery efforts, the psychology of a disaster. And I feel like I'm preaching to the choir now that we've been through a pandemic for over 2 years now. So makes it a little bit easier to talk about that kind of stuff. So I always say don't be a disaster in disaster. Again, we can talk about this a lot easier now that we've been through a pandemic, but wear your PPE. Take care of your mental health. Take care of your physical health. Check in with your team and stay in your lane. Lead, follower, get out of the way. Those are military sayings. Stay in your lane means do your job. Lead, follower, get out of the way means, again, do your job. But if you find that what you've been assigned is too taxing for you, or it's overwhelming, or you can do more, speak up about that. But don't get in the way of somebody else doing their job. And again, I'll point to the Knowles Wilderness First Aid Pocket Guide. This is a triage scenario of if somebody does become injured, how you do a case assessment of that individual very quickly. Disaster area barriers. So these are all images from South Carolina from our flood of 2015. So that road probably when the water was over it looked perfectly fine, right? But then when the water receded, oh, there is no road in the middle of the road. Part of it's missing. So during recovery preparation and throughout the recovery process, you'll need to take note of physical barriers that impede your recovery process. Allow extra time for travel, and remember that road closures can change minute to minute and never go around barriers. Our road closures were honestly changing minute to minute in the city of Columbia. So we constantly had to reroute ourselves to get around different areas, to go get supplies, get back to our homes. It was a little insane. Supplies can be delayed or stopped for days or weeks from coming into an area. And remember that many of the supplies you will need, everyone else in the disaster zone will need as well. So running to the store for supplies, you might get there and you might not find what you need. And the fewer trips, the better. So this is another example of a road that was washed out. Designate a supply coordinator for future recovery efforts now, if you've not already done so within that ICS framework. Consider now if there are supplies that you can keep on hand to prepare for disaster. How much space do you have for these items? Do you have a Library of Congress kind of space, or do you have a Dumbarton amount of space? Where is the best location to keep these items, and what is your budget and credit card spending limit for emergency response situations? So this is a solar panel to charge our phones. This is at Pocky Island. Before you go out and rush out to purchase everything in the stock disaster supply shopping list that I showed you earlier, consider what you already have on hand. And this is just an example of, we have big box fans. We have lab supplies that actually can turn into disaster recovery supplies. So kind of look at what you have, consider how it can be repurposed for a disaster, and don't feel like you have to spend an exorbitant amount of money in the event of a disaster. You might have things already in place to use for a disaster recovery effort. Our team has access to larger things like boats, dredges, generators, and chainsaws that we did use. So does your institution have access to things like that that you might not have in your facility? And I always say, don't forget to fuel up your vehicles and equipment prior to a disaster. This is just good housekeeping in general. Having fuel, having everything ready to go. If you have emergency fuel tanks, fill those up as well. We have emergency fuel tanks we keep for things as well. So this is the front of the facility. Again, the road is where the water is. The water should technically be behind that tallest pine tree in the back, but it's not. So this is the impacted facility. Take lots of photographs of your disaster area prior to entering, while entering, during all stages of recovery efforts. FEMA in the United States likes lots of photographs, and specifically photographs with measurable features in them. For example, water up to the car window, water up to the top of your curation stack. All those marks, they're going to be looking at. Block access to your facility or property until you or your team have completed initial assessment and laid the groundwork for the recovery efforts. Designate a public information officer or media liaison prior to disaster, as well as an operations coordinator to oversee volunteer and staff responsibilities. So controlling access. The guy in the purple shirt right here is a National Geographic photographer who showed up within the first 30 minutes of our recovery effort. Yes, it was fun. So stick to your disaster recovery plan and adjust details as needed. If new crews show up, don't allow them to dictate, news crews rather, show up, don't allow them to dictate what you do for a good shot, which is what he was doing. Be respectful, however, remember your priorities. It's the safety of your staff and the proper recovery and documentation of your archives and facility. Have a check-in area and a way to identify those coming in to volunteer, such as a wristband or a vest, anything like that. Use an app like Eventbrite to register volunteers, log their time, and have them read and agree to legal release forms. FEMA is going to look at your volunteers and help give you money back for your volunteer time. This photo right here depicts approximately 10 to 15% of the total archives that we recovered from the facility. The removal of loaned collections is priority. Paper records, photographs, negatives, slides were our second priority because they would mold within 24 hours. And in October in South Carolina, the temperature was still in the 80s or 90s and very humid, subtropical environment. So loaned collections, number one, and then all your paper documents is your number two recovery. Consider now if you'll need special assistance for the recovery of certain archives. An example will be shown a little later. If you do not already have a disaster recovery contract in place with a company like Belflor or some other property restoration company, I would highly recommend you get that in place now. It doesn't cost you anything. It's just kind of a hold. Ask those who are emotionally attached, and this goes back to the psychological aspects of things, and cannot make effective decisions to step away from it for a time when they see something like this. They may not be able to return to the recovery efforts, and that's completely fine. They might be able to assist via phone call or video chat, but the reality is in our world as archaeologists and cultural resource managers that sometimes collections like this represent somebody's entire career, their entire life's work, and to see it destroyed like this can be incredibly psychologically damaging, and that needs to be acknowledged. Since we did not have a disaster recovery contract in place when we were hit by the flood of 2015, we had to come up with a plan for on-site stabilization of documents. We sorted through all documents, field notes, books, articles. We made a decision to discard items that we could replace, such as books that were easily accessible. Everything that was discarded was documented. And again, documentation is everything from start to finish in the disaster recovery process. We purchased 5 freezers. You see 4 of them here. And we froze 100 cubic feet of documents. These were field notes. These were not historic documents. We actually did not have any historic documents in these collections. What is your institution's current digital archive situation? And are all modern paper documents, field notes, and maps all stored electronically and off-site? If paper documents were damaged during the disaster, can you make an executive decision to reduce your disaster recovery costs and discard paper documents and rely on the digital archive? And so that's what one of the freezers looks like. Now that you have assessed the situation and hopefully identified the collections loaned to you in your institution in the most fragile and time-sensitive archive, a determination needs to be made if you can recover everything in place or you need to acquire another long-term facility for the recovery efforts. Old schools and civic centers within your community are ideal places to provide this kind of space that you need to recover items. So scope out possible long-term recovery locations now. The space will need to be well ventilated, have heat, AC, water, electricity, restroom facilities. You will also need to establish what we call a use agreement with a government agency, or a lease if the owner is just a private facility. Ideally, you should not move from one location to the next, like what we did. So we moved from one triage facility to another. You should only typically do one move. A triage, there we go. A triage phase 2 of sorts was set up at the SCDNR Sticks receiving compound. This is our fish hatchery, one of our fish hatcheries in West Columbia, which was the county next to the one that got dramatically impacted. Within 2 days, the recovered items, which were coming into this facility in truckloads, which you saw earlier, exceeded the available space. This, compounded by the threat of another wave of severe weather, hastened the acquisition of a new facility for long-term recovery efforts to take place. So the Lexington School District 2, which I was a student at for kindergarten through 12th grade, donated the use of their old fine arts facility in West Columbia to the DNR for the duration of our recovery efforts. The recovery effort took place at this facility from October 2015 through May 2016 with the help of 135 volunteers who volunteered over 1,000 hours of labor. I also had 6 temporary part-time staff that I hired specifically for this recovery effort. And that was in addition to full-time and part-time DNR staff that came in and helped me. All available space in this facility was used, and although quite large at approximately 5,000 square feet, the layout of the recovery effort had to be transformed every few weeks in order to keep up with the changing focus of our work. This is the check-in station in the lobby. So you see the med kit, water, snacks. We have a task board, if we're looking for a particular collection that day. All that information is here at the front. Following the freezing of documents to stop the mold process, we quickly focused our attention on addressing organic material from the loaned collection that we had taken out, and drawing approximately 15,000 photographs, negatives, and slides. So we brought in experts to help us address this leather object, and you should take note of this phone number. This is the National Heritage Responders Network. They are open 24/7, and these individuals drove in from Atlanta, Georgia, 4 hours away from where we were, just for an afternoon to help us stabilize this pair of leather shoes that was starting to mold over in the loan collection. They're amazing, and they do this for free, and they're fabulous. So when it came to stabilizing 15,000 photographs, negatives, and slides in the collection, I made the decision to hang the photographs to dry rather than laying them flat, so that we could dry approximately 3,000 photographs a day in the course of a week. All these images were scanned during the summer of 2016 for digital storage on our servers. And here's a good time to take a brief aside about storing photographs. When you scan images from negative slides or paper photographs, you should scan them as high-resolution TIFFs. JPEGs will degrade over time. And when you take digital photographs, either in the field or on a project during a recovery situation like this, you should make sure the photographs are being captured as raw files, preferably because they are non-destructible files that you would hand over to FEMA. And so this is what images look like. So they were hit with waves of flooded water. And the first photograph in a stack would look like this when we recovered it. The RGB, the red, green, blue of the image would be washed away. But once you strip that initial photograph off, the ones behind it were perfectly fine. And so you put them in distilled water, kind of soak them apart, gently peel them away. They're in sticky blocks, were tagged with every single site name, and then hung to dry. And so you see us over there hanging them to dry in this facility, about 3,000 a day. And they're just reference photographs from excavations over the last 20 years. And then negatives were laid flat. They were not hung to dry, as were slides. So they're all up here. And then just a brief aside about artwork. We were also hit by Hurricane Florence in 2018. My grandmother is an artist, and so these are some of her pieces that I stabilized, but just removing metal if you have artwork, getting the artwork out of the frames as quickly as possible. That's really all I want to say about artwork at this time. Just get the metal away from it and get artwork out of the frames to dry it quickly. But as a cultural resource manager, you know, we talk about heritage at risk all the time. We're talking about these great disasters like floods and fires and hurricanes. But the biggest problem you're ever going to run into as a cultural resource manager is a burst water pipe in your facility or an overflowing HVAC system. And so this is just an example from my home here when I came home from an excavation and realized that there was a burst water pipe underneath my home. And so this was the recovery effort from that. But that truly is going to be your biggest issue. And that's what you're going to use that interior recovery kit for the most, or taking care of internal leaks and pipe bursts. In textiles, the coolest thing that I learned at the HART training, if you do have textiles in your collection, is have a lot of white cloths on hand and these small little paint rollers to squeegee out water from cloth. It is the easiest, cheapest thing to do. And then you move forward with the restoration process from there. But those are some really cheap, small things you can keep in your recovery kits for textiles if you happen to have those in your collection. And back to loans. So within your collection, what's your plan or arrangement to take care of your private or loan collections following a disaster? Is your institution responsible for the recovery, or does the home institution or individual want to re-curate the items themselves? So consider how these items will be transported back to a home institution if they need to be re-curated elsewhere, considering what personnel time that'll take and travel time that'll take to get them to that loaned facility. And through this whole process, you need to be documenting everything. After loaned collections and paper, artifacts were the third priority, and it took most of the time to recover. This is what truly was the 8 months of recovery. So floodwaters filled most of our bags. The water pressure burst open every single artifact bag and flooded it. And remember that water equals weight. So you want to drain as much of this water out as you can at the disaster area prior to moving it to a recovery facility. Oh yes, very nasty. Because artifacts impacted by the 2015 flood floated for 3 days, archive boxes were completely saturated, as you can see here. After draining as much flood water from the artifact bags as possible, all artifact bags were placed in sandbags. 1 bag to 1 box equation, essentially. Identification tags were placed in the sandbags on top of the artifacts, and key identifying information was written on the flagging tape that was placed around the bag itself. Moving artifacts from boxes that were falling apart to sandbags made it a safer transport situation and easier to store during the long-term recovery effort. And as you could probably see from prior photographs, we did not do this initially. This is something I'm strongly recommending to those of y'all who run into a disaster situation in the future. If we had done this from the start, our recovery effort would have been so much safer and so much faster in the long run. Consider how much garbage you will produce during the recovery process. Do you have a truck and possibly a trailer to dispose of garbage on a regular basis? And has your county or geographical area designated a disposal area for the disaster materials? That weight of trash for a county actually counts towards their FEMA reimbursement, so they get money off of that. Artifacts impacted by the 2015 flood were already curated, so we're kind of go through a re-curation process. But all bags, tags, boxes that were in the floodwaters had to be discarded and replaced, and all artifacts had to be washed again because they were covered in a whole lot of nastiness. So this is an outdoor washing station for our oversized objects. So it's just kitchen spray heads, and we worked off of foot pedals. And this again is a piece of it's a screening rack from an excavation site. So just reusing the archaeological supplies that we already had. This is what metal objects look like once they've hit floodwater, kind of pretty nasty. And so those had to go through an electrolysis process again. And drying racks were used. Original tags, bags, and other identifying information were saved during the drying process, and they were placed under cardboard fry baskets. So we purchased these from a website that catered to restaurants. So this is what you put French fries in, or hamburgers and hot dogs. But this allowed us to keep the dirty away from the clean. So old tags, bags, and other identifying information were thrown out once the re-curation process was finished. And we just lined them up like you would in a lab, keeping all that identifying information together until the end. We also tagged each rack each day, so we knew which day each rack was washed on. Tags with no visible information. You might find this happens if somebody wrote in pen accidentally on a tag. Never give up on these. What you do is you hold them up to the light of a window or a door, and you can see the impressions of the pressing down on that paper from the original writing, and you can get the identifying information that way. So we never really lost any information, even though you can't physically see anything here. Once collections are processed, keep them separate from those that are still going through the recovery process. Our re-curated collections went on a top stage in this fine arts center. It was visually and physically separate from the collection still needing recovery work. While we had a dedicated staff working 40 hours per week for 8 months, we also had the help of 135 volunteers during the recovery process. These are volunteers from the Veterans Curation Program. So what you want to remember here is you need to document all volunteer names and times they worked so that your institution can report that information to FEMA for reimbursement. Volunteer time counts towards your 25% match for FEMA to reimburse you 75%. It's a 25-75 share. What is your institution's policy for hiring staff quickly? In state government agencies, that process of hiring is sometimes tedious. Hiring part-time employees is much faster than full-time. And I found that walking into the HR department with a photo of the disaster situation expedited the hiring process a lot better. Also ask yourself, what are reasonable hours for your staff to work during a disaster recovery scenario? Do they receive compensation time, overtime pay, or are their hours capped? Especially if they're students, their hours are capped in our state at 20 hours a week. Remember that you and your staff can potentially be recovering from a disaster for months or years. Be cautious of fatigue and illness. Also establish and maintain a rotating schedule. Substitute leaders and assistant leaders that know everything that's going on, the next steps to take, and what goals have been met, how to train new volunteers and staff, and what supplies are needed. Your institutions should establish a hierarchy of disaster preparedness and recovery leadership and substitutes before a disaster ever happens. In other words, an incident command system. Does your institution have a budget set aside for disaster recovery efforts? Our payroll alone was nearly $70,000 for flood recovery, plus the total cost of supplies, rent, utilities, and fuel. Does your institution need approval to divert funds to change fiscal year spending plans? Is your institution working with grant money or other funding sources that are obligated? These are things to consider now. So it took 10 months post-flood for a 75% reimbursement of our expenses to be deposited into our accounts from FEMA. So what delay of a reimbursement like that would it do to your institution's accounts, future budgets, future research, or staff salaries? At the end of August of 2016, our agency entered into a lease agreement with the South Carolina State Museum for 1 year as we look for a new facility to house our collections, lab, and offices. In April 2017, our team moved into Parker Annex Archaeology Center on the old South Carolina State Hospital property. And we renamed it, or we moved into Parker Annex and renamed it Parker Annex Archaeology Center. And this building contains offices for our staff and interns, a lab that's set up to seat 28, teaching space, conference space, and curation space. And so these are some interior images of Parker Annex and the moving of those cleaned boxes of objects into mobile stacks. And so we would like to do more disaster recovery training at Parker Annex. We kind of experimented this past summer with our interns, and it was really fun. I recommend for those of y'all who want to continue with some heritage disaster response and recovery training to look into HART. They have an amazing website with lots of resources as well that you can pull from. And this is me with some Library of Congress folks and a military personnel behind us learning photography recovery. And I'd just like to acknowledge all the people that donated supplies and time to us during our recovery efforts from across the entire region of the Southeast. If you want to know more about the flood of 2015, there's this amazing archived podcast called Narrative that spoke to people who were directly impacted by the flood in the Columbia area and across the state. And just a little plug for our internship program. We will be talking about disaster prep and recovery in the program and hopefully doing some hands-on training. So you can download the application here. It's due the first week of February. And with that, I will wrap it up because I think I've already been over time. Oh, maybe I have 8 minutes. I don't know.